75-year-old Walter Grayson had just boarded a flight back to Denver after attending a memorial service for his fallen comrades. The trip had been emotionally exhausting, and all he wanted was to get home and rest. The plane was relatively quiet, and the crew was making their final preparations before takeoff. As he settled into his seat, Walter politely signaled a flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with a sharp, professional demeanor. Melissa Carter, as her name tag read, glanced his way briefly. "Excuse me, miss," Walter said with a polite smile. "Could I have a cup of water, please?" Melissa barely acknowledged his request. "I'll get to it when I can," she replied curtly before moving on. At first, Walter wasn't bothered. He understood that flight attendants had many tasks to handle before takeoff. He waited patiently, expecting her to return soon. But minutes passed, and she walked by again without a glance in his direction. Walter hesitated before asking again, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'd really appreciate a glass of water." This time, Melissa didn't even turn to look at him. She simply kept walking, her posture stiff as if she hadn't heard him at all. Walter frowned, feeling slightly confused. Perhaps she was too busy or had forgotten. Giving her the benefit of the doubt, he waited a little longer. Finally, after another few minutes, he tried once more. "Miss, could I please have some water?" Melissa suddenly stopped in her tracks. She turned to him, scanning him from head to toe with a look of irritation. Her response was cold, almost dismissive. "I'm busy. You'll have to wait." A few passengers nearby glanced up, sensing the tension. Walter blinked in surprise. He had been on countless flights in his lifetime, and never had he been spoken to like this. He wasn't demanding anything extravagant, just a simple glass of water. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Maybe she was having a rough day. He decided to let it go for now. But as more time passed and his thirst grew, so did his frustration. This wasn't just about the water anymore, it was about respect. Walter wasn't the type to make a scene, but something about this interaction didn't sit right with him. He had spent his life in the military, where respect was a core value, and right now he felt completely disregarded. Finally, after waiting quietly and growing increasingly uncomfortable, he decided to speak up. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," he said firmly, but still politely. Melissa, now visibly annoyed, let out an exasperated sigh. "You're not the only passenger here," she snapped. "I'll get to you when I get to you." Walter clenched his jaw, keeping his composure. "I understand you're busy," he said, his voice steady. "But I'd still like to speak to someone in charge." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "No, you'll get your drink when I say you will." The tension in the air grew thick. Passengers nearby exchanged looks, some shifting in their seats uncomfortably. A woman across the aisle whispered something to the man next to her, glancing at Walter with concern. Walter had had enough. He wasn't about to let someone treat him this way, especially not someone whose job was to assist passengers. "I'd like to speak with someone else," he insisted. Melissa stood still, her arms crossed, as if challenging him to push further. The passengers around them could sense that something was about to happen, though no one could have predicted just how much this situation would spiral. After a long pause, Melissa let out an irritated huff and muttered something under her breath. Walter couldn't quite make out what she said, but her tone made it clear. It wasn't pleasant. His patience, already thin, was wearing out fast. He had been nothing but polite, yet she continued to dismiss him. His fingers tightened around the armrest as he spoke again, this time with more authority. "Please, I'd like to talk to a supervisor." By now, even more passengers were watching. A few leaned forward slightly, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Melissa glared at him. "I told you, you'll get served when I get to you," she snapped. Walter felt a surge of disbelief. Was this really happening over a simple request for water? His military instincts kicked in. He had spent decades following protocol and treating others with dignity. But right now, he was being spoken to like he was nothing more than a nuisance. "I really think I need to talk to someone in charge," he said again, keeping his voice steady despite his growing frustration. Melissa let out an exaggerated sigh and folded her arms across her chest. "If you don't sit down and wait, I'll have to call the captain," she warned. That was the tipping point. Walter had been patient. He had been reasonable. But now, she was treating him like a problem instead of a passenger. He took a deep breath and did something he never thought he'd have to do. He raised his hand, signaling for attention. "Excuse me, please," he said loudly enough for those around him to hear. "I need to speak with the captain." Melissa rolled her eyes in frustration before storming off toward the front of the plane. Walter sat back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This situation was far from over. And in just 6 minutes, everything would take an unbelievable turn that no one on that flight saw coming. The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable. Walter Grayson sat still in his seat, his back straight, his hands resting on his lap. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief at how a simple request had spiraled into something so dramatic. Around him, passengers whispered among themselves, shaking their heads or stealing glances in his direction. No one had expected such an intense standoff over something as minor as a glass of water. Then the captain arrived. A man in his early 50s, Captain Jonathan Reynolds walked down the aisle with calm authority. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, but his posture made it clear. He was here to take control of the situation. He made his way to Melissa Carter, the flight attendant who had dismissed Walter's request so coldly. She stood near the back of the plane, her arms crossed, her expression stiff. The two exchanged words in hushed tones, their conversation too quiet for anyone else to hear. Walter couldn't make out what was being said, but he could read body language well enough. Melissa looked frustrated, maybe even defensive. Her stiff stance didn't soften as the captain spoke. Passengers watched intently, trying to guess what was happening. After a brief exchange, Captain Reynolds turned to Walter. "Sir," he said, his voice firm yet measured, "I understand there's been a disagreement." Walter nodded, still stunned that things had escalated this far. "I only asked for some water," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," the captain continued, but then hesitated for a brief moment, as if carefully choosing his next words. "I need you to remain seated while I handle this situation." Walter didn't argue. He had no interest in making the ordeal worse. He simply nodded. Captain Reynolds turned back to Melissa. Their conversation resumed, but this time, Walter noticed something shift. The captain's posture straightened, his tone became sharper, and Melissa's expression changed from defiance to something closer to realization. Whatever was being said, it was clear, it wasn't in her favor. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Passengers who had initially kept to themselves now fidgeted in their seats, exchanging glances and whispers. The whole cabin was on edge, waiting for what would happen next. Then, just as it seemed the tension couldn't build any further, Captain Reynolds took a step back, inhaled deeply, and delivered a decision that left the entire plane in shock. "I'm afraid we've reached a point where we can't continue like this," he said, his tone even but unyielding. "I'm going to have to ask the flight attendant to leave the flight." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. Walter's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. Melissa's expression froze, her mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but the captain didn't give her the chance. "Please gather your things," he instructed firmly. "You'll be escorted off the plane." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Melissa's face drained of color. Her eyes darted around as if looking for support from her fellow crew members, but no one stepped forward to defend her. Passengers sat in silence, some too stunned to react, others exchanging bewildered glances. A few checked their watches, perhaps wondering if this would delay their flight, but most were too caught up in the surreal moment unfolding before them. Walter watched as Melissa slowly gathered her belongings. The reality of the situation seemed to hit her all at once, and her movements became stiff, mechanical. The captain signaled to another flight attendant, who approached hesitantly. Together, they stood for a moment, then without another word, Melissa turned and began the long walk down the aisle toward the exit. Her face was a mix of anger and embarrassment. Walter remained seated, watching her pass by, unsure of how to feel. He hadn't asked for this. He had only wanted to be treated with basic courtesy. Yet, somehow, the situation had escalated to a level he never could have imagined. A small pang of guilt surfaced within him, but it was quickly overshadowed by relief. He had stood up for himself, and now it was over. Or so he thought. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some passengers nodded approvingly, as if satisfied that justice had been served. Others looked unsettled, still processing what had just happened. The whole ordeal had gone from a minor conflict to something much, much bigger. It was no longer about a drink. It was about respect. And everyone on that flight had just witnessed what happens when someone refuses to give it. As Melissa disappeared from sight, Captain Reynolds returned to the front of the plane. The flight crew scrambled to regain a sense of normalcy, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The energy was different now, charged with the weight of what had just unfolded. Walter sat still, exhaling deeply. This was supposed to be a simple flight home. Instead, it had become a story no one on board would ever forget. The flight moved forward, but something about it felt different. The usual hum of conversation had been replaced with whispers. Hushed discussions between passengers still reeling from what had just happened. Walter Grayson sat in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together, staring straight ahead. The flight attendant, Melissa Carter, was gone, escorted off the plane in front of everyone. And yet, the weight of the situation lingered. Passengers were murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others questioning whether they had really just witnessed a flight attendant being removed over something so small. Walter shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. He was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, and just wanted to get home. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't push aside the thought that this never should have happened in the first place. All he had asked for was a simple glass of water. Yet the way Melissa had treated him, so dismissive, so condescending, had sparked something in him. He had spent years in the military, where respect was a fundamental value, and what he had experienced today was the opposite of that. Around him, the cabin slowly returned to some form of normalcy, but there was an unshakable tension in the air. The flight crew, now working with a renewed sense of professionalism, tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But people were still watching Walter. Some of the looks were sympathetic. Others were awkward, unsure of what to make of the whole situation. A few rows ahead, a woman leaned toward her seatmate, whispering, "I can't believe that just happened. Have you ever seen anything like that before?" Her companion shook his head. "Never. I mean, I get that she was rude, but to actually get kicked off? That's insane." A few other passengers nodded in quiet agreement. Some clearly believed Walter had been treated unfairly. Others weren't sure who was in the wrong. But one thing was certain, this was no ordinary flight. As Walter sat quietly, a different flight attendant approached. Unlike Melissa, this one had a softer expression. She looked to be around the same age, but her demeanor was entirely different. No arrogance, no defensiveness, just quiet concern. "Sir," she said gently, stopping beside his seat, "I just wanted to check on you and make sure you're okay." Walter looked up at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I'm fine," he said after a pause. "Just shaken up." She gave him a small, understanding nod. "I'm really sorry for the way things went earlier," she said, lowering her voice. "That's not how we do things. We'll be sure to take care of you from here on out." Walter nodded again, appreciating her words, but still feeling the sting of how he had been treated. "I just don't understand," he admitted, shaking his head. "I've been on so many flights, and I've never had an issue like this before." The flight attendant sighed. "I know, we don't usually have problems like this, but I promise, we're looking into it." She gave him a small, reassuring smile before stepping away to continue her work. Walter exhaled slowly, a mix of frustration and relief settling over him. He hadn't wanted any of this, he had only wanted a drink. But now, this small moment had turned into something much bigger. It wasn't just about Melissa Carter and the way she had treated him, it was about something deeper, a system in which passengers like him could be brushed aside without a second thought. He had spent his entire life being taught to respect others, and in return, he had always expected the same. But today, he had seen firsthand what happens when that respect is missing. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a moment. The flight wasn't long, just a few more hours to go, but it felt like an eternity. His mind kept racing. Would the airline reinstate Melissa after an investigation? Or was this the end of her career? The thought lingered, but Walter knew he had no control over it. What he did know was that things like this shouldn't happen. It wasn't about asking for special treatment. It was about basic courtesy, about the way people in service roles treated others and the choices they made when things went wrong. As the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight's progress, Walter let out a deep sigh. For now, there was nothing left to do but wait. But one thing was certain. The rest of the flight would never be the same. Passengers had witnessed something unexpected today, and it was bound to change the way they looked at the world around them. No matter how much he tried to move past it, the moment kept creeping back into Walter Grayson's thoughts. Every so often, he caught the eyes of another passenger. Quick glances, hesitant looks. He could tell they were thinking about it too. It wasn't every day that a flight attendant was escorted off a plane. The crew continued their duties, but there was a tension in their movements now, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. They remained professional, but it was clear they were shaken. The weight of what had happened still loomed over them. Up in the cockpit, Captain Jonathan Reynolds remained in control, but his decision had sent ripples through the entire flight. Walter couldn't help but wonder, how did the other crew members feel? Were they relieved that a toxic presence had been removed, or were they uneasy about what this could mean for them in the future? A few minutes later, the flight attendant who had approached Walter earlier, Samantha Hayes, returned. This time, she wasn't just there to check on him. She held a small, folded note in her hand. She leaned down, her voice soft but steady. "I know this has been an unsettling experience for you," she said gently. "I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened. We truly value our passengers, and this isn't the kind of service we want to provide." Walter nodded, appreciating the sincerity in her voice, but the lingering feeling of injustice refused to fade. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. I don't understand why she acted that way. I've been on so many flights, and I've never had a problem before. How did it escalate to this?" Samantha sighed and glanced down at the note in her hand before looking back at him. "I've been with this airline for years, and I can tell you, we don't take things like this lightly," she assured him. "We'll be investigating what happened, and I promise I'll make sure they hear your side of things." She offered him a small, that reassuring smile before stepping away. For a brief moment, Walter felt a sense of relief. At least someone was acknowledging what had happened. At least someone was taking it seriously. But that sense of relief didn't last long. In the pit of his stomach, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wronged in a way that went beyond a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't just about a drink. It was about respect, about dignity. And for those few uncomfortable moments with Melissa Carter, both had been stripped from him. Around him, the passengers had begun to settle back into their routines. Some were asleep, others had turned back to their books or movies, but there was no denying it. The mood had changed. The easygoing atmosphere that had existed before takeoff was gone. People were processing what they had witnessed. Walter could still feel the quiet stares in his direction. Some were filled with sympathy, others with uncertainty. A few seemed to say, "I can't believe that actually happened." Samantha's apology had been a kind gesture, but it wasn't enough to erase what had taken place. Walter wasn't the kind of man to seek revenge, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that the consequences for Melissa's actions needed to be just as swift and serious as the way she had dismissed him. She had underestimated him. She had thought he would let it go. And maybe if he were a younger man or a different kind of person, he would have. But he had spent his life standing for something, and today he had stood for himself. As the minutes ticked by, Walter's thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. Captain Reynolds had made the decision to remove Melissa, but what did that mean for her career? Would she be reinstated after the investigation? Or was this the end of the road for her? He didn't know. But what he did know was that one person's actions had caused ripples far beyond this single flight. The passengers had seen it, the crew had seen it, and now it was part of the airline's history, whether they wanted it to be or not. Walter found himself wondering, what would happen if more people stood up for themselves in situations like this? How often did passengers just accept poor treatment, choosing to stay silent because they didn't want to cause trouble? How many people had been mistreated by someone in a position of power but had never spoken up? And how many had let their dignity be trampled on simply because it was easier than making a scene? The thought lingered as he turned to look out the window. The clouds passed by in endless waves beneath him, a peaceful contrast to the storm that had erupted inside the cabin just an hour earlier. He had fought for respect today. And while the flight wasn't over yet, it felt like he had won a small battle. But the real victory wasn't just in what had happened to Melissa Carter. It was in what he had learned about himself. Standing up mattered, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was easier to stay silent. And as the flight continued, he knew this experience would stay with him long after he reached his destination. Walter Grayson had hoped for a quiet flight, just a chance to rest, reflect, and get home after an emotionally draining trip. Instead, he had found himself caught in a confrontation that no one had expected. Every time he tried to push the incident out of his mind, it crept back in. The whole thing had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He had expected more. From the airline, from the crew, from the people who were supposed to ensure a smooth and comfortable journey. Instead, he had been met with dismissiveness, hostility, and outright disrespect. His thoughts kept drifting back to Melissa Carter, the flight attendant who had refused to serve him and had ultimately been removed from the flight. He didn't know her. He had no idea what had been going through her mind that day. Maybe she was dealing with personal issues. Maybe she was just having a rough shift. But no matter the reason, her treatment of him had been unacceptable. She hadn't just ignored his request, she had deliberately dismissed him, refusing to even acknowledge him as a person worthy of basic courtesy. It wasn't just a small mistake, it was a pattern of behavior. And it wasn't just Walter who had noticed it. The captain had seen it, the passengers had seen it, and that was what made the situation so disturbing. As he reflected on it, something became clear. This wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. This was about how easily people in service positions could forget their responsibility to treat others with dignity. Walter had witnessed it before. At restaurants, in customer service lines, even at medical offices. He had seen people brushed off, ignored, or treated with impatience simply because they were in need of help. He had experienced it himself a few times. But this time, it had gone too far. And for the first time, he had stood up for himself in a way he never had before. His mind drifted back to the moment he had asked to speak with a supervisor. Normally, he would have let it go. He wasn't someone who picked fights or made a scene. But this time, something felt different. It wasn't about the water anymore. It was about the way he had been treated. He had been patient. He had been polite. And yet, that hadn't been enough. So he had asked again. And when Melissa Carter had refused, he had pushed back. Not because he wanted to escalate things, but because he wasn't going to let her dismiss his dignity any longer. He thought about Captain Jonathan Reynolds and the way he had handled the situation. Walter had been surprised at how quickly the captain had intervened. He hadn't hesitated. He had assessed the situation, recognized the issue, and made a decision. And Walter respected him for that. Too often, people in leadership avoided making difficult calls. But the captain had done what was necessary, even if it meant removing one of his own crew members. Still, Walter knew that the decision hadn't been easy. Firing someone, or even disciplining them, wasn't something people took lightly. The captain had made a tough choice. And whether or not he had intended to send a message, he had. Walter respected him not just for standing up for a passenger, but for taking decisive action in a moment when most people would have tried to ignore the problem. The question now was, what would happen next? Would Melissa lose her job? Would she get a second chance? Would she even recognize how much her own choices had led to this? Walter wasn't sure. A part of him felt uneasy about the idea of someone losing their livelihood over a single incident. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about all the times she had treated passengers like they didn't matter. If she had spoken to him that way, how many others had she treated with the same coldness and disrespect? How many passengers before him had just accepted it and let it slide? He would never know the answer. But he did know that her actions couldn't simply be ignored. The airline had taken it seriously. The captain had taken it seriously. And now, Walter wondered, would this change anything moving forward? Would the crew be more careful about how they treated passengers? Would the airline take steps to ensure that no one else had to deal with something like this? Or would it all be forgotten as soon as the flight landed? As the plane began its descent, Walter felt a sense of unease settle over him. He didn't know what would happen to Melissa Carter. But he did know that things had changed. This flight had started as just another routine trip home. Now, it had become a story that would follow this airline for a long time. Passengers would talk about it. People would share their experiences. And whether the airline liked it or not, this moment had left a mark. But in the end, the most important question wasn't about Melissa. It wasn't even about the flight. It was about how we treat people, and whether or not this airline would learn from what had happened. As Captain Reynolds' voice came over the intercom, announcing their approach to Denver, Walter let out a slow breath. The flight was almost over. And soon, he would be home. As the plane began its final descent, Walter Grayson leaned back in his seat, staring out the window, but not really seeing anything. His mind was still caught in the whirlwind of the past few hours. The flight, which should have been uneventful, had turned into something far more complicated. The reassuring words from Samantha Hayes, the calm authority of Captain Reynolds, none of it had erased the bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what it represented. Would the airline take his statements seriously? Would they conduct a real investigation, or would it all be swept under the rug? Would Melissa Carter, the flight attendant who had dismissed and humiliated him, take responsibility for her actions? Or would she twist the story into something else, something that made her look like the victim? And beyond that, how many people had suffered in silence? How many passengers had experienced something similar, but had let it go, afraid to speak up, afraid of making a scene? Walter had stood up for himself today. But what about the ones who never did? The wheels touched down smoothly, the soft jolt of the landing snapping Walter out of his thoughts. The engines roared as they slowed, and for the first time in a while, the cabin felt still. He glanced around. Some passengers had clearly relaxed, relieved to finally be on solid ground. Others sat stiffly, still processing what they had just witnessed. The woman who had whispered to her seatmate earlier now stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. Others scrolled through their phones, trying to return to normalcy. But the tension still lingered, like an echo of the confrontation that had shaken them all. As the plane taxied to the gate, Walter started to gather his things. A strange discomfort settled over him, not just from the long flight, but from the realization that this wasn't something he could simply walk away from. He had spent the entire trip trying to push the incident aside, but it had followed him, woven itself into his experience, etched itself into his memory. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment in the sky. It was a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control when basic respect was missing. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their safe arrival and thanking everyone for flying with the airline. Routine words. Business as usual. But for Walter, nothing about this flight had been business as usual. This wasn't just about an argument. This wasn't just about Melissa Carter being removed from the plane. This was about a lesson he hadn't expected to learn. And as he stepped into the aisle, pulling his bag over his shoulder, he realized this experience would stay with him. As he made his way toward the exit, a passenger stopped him. A woman, likely in her 40s, had been sitting a few rows behind him. She met his eyes and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. "I saw what happened earlier," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just wanted to say, I think you handled it with a lot of dignity. Not many people would have spoken up like that." Walter felt a slight warmth rise in his chest. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. "Thank you," he replied, unsure of what else to say. She smiled, then turned and stepped off the plane. A few more passengers nodded to him as they passed, silent gestures of support, of understanding. And in that moment, Walter realized this wasn't just about him anymore. This had become something bigger. As he stepped into the terminal, the usual buzz of airport life surrounded him. People rushing to their gates, families reuniting, announcements crackling over the speakers. But Walter's steps were slow, his thoughts still tangled in the events of the flight. He had never wanted to cause a scene. But maybe, in some strange way, this needed to happen. Maybe it was time for more people to speak up when they were treated unfairly. Maybe it was time for airlines and all service industries to take a closer look at how they treated their customers. Maybe it was time for people to stop accepting disrespect as just part of the experience. He could already picture the conversations he would have once he got home. He would tell his friends about what had happened, maybe even add some humor to lighten the weight of it. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't just an anecdote about a flight gone wrong. This was a story about respect, and how important it was to demand it. As Walter Grayson reached the baggage claim area, he spotted his suitcase making its slow rotation around the carousel. The familiar sounds of the airport, announcements overhead, the hum of rolling suitcases, the occasional laughter of reunited families, should have made him feel at ease, but his mind was still back on that plane. The fight for respect, in the grand scheme of things, might have seemed small to an outsider. But to him, it had been a victory. A reminder that standing up for yourself, even in uncomfortable moments, was always a choice worth making. He pulled his bag from the carousel and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. As he stepped out of the airport, the crisp evening air hit his face. The city around him was alive, full of people going about their business, unaffected by the experience that had just changed him. For them, this was just another day. For him, it was a day he wouldn't forget. As Walter walked toward the taxi stand, his mind replayed the confrontation. The dismissiveness, the cold stare of Melissa Carter, the way she had looked at him as if he didn't matter. It wasn't just about her attitude. It was about something deeper. How often did small moments like this turn into something bigger? How many times had people felt invisible, overlooked, brushed aside, without ever speaking up? And how many people on that flight would now think twice before ignoring a situation like this again? He climbed into a taxi and settled into the back seat. The driver, a man in his 40s with a relaxed demeanor, adjusted the mirror and asked the usual small-talk questions. Coming in from a long trip? Yeah. Walter answered simply. How was the flight? Walter hesitated. He could have just nodded, let the conversation die, but something about the driver's easy tone made him feel like talking. Like maybe, just maybe, saying it out loud would help him process it. Actually, it was a bit strange, Walter admitted, his voice measured. I was treated pretty badly by one of the flight attendants. I asked for a drink and she refused. Then when I asked again, she got rude. It escalated, and the captain ended up removing her from the flight. The driver's eyebrows lifted slightly as he glanced at Walter in the rearview mirror. Wow, that's something. I've been on some bad flights, but nothing like that. Walter gave a small nod, still unsure of how to explain it in a way that fully captured how surreal it had felt. Because at the core of it, it wasn't just about the drink. It was about how quickly something so small had turned into something massive. He shook his head. I don't know. I was patient, polite, and it still ended up like that. I guess I wasn't expecting that kind of treatment. The driver let out a thoughtful sigh. I get it. I think people forget sometimes that they're dealing with other human beings. They get so wrapped up in their own stuff that they stop seeing the people right in front of them. Walter turned to look out the window as the city passed by in blurs of neon signs and streetlights. The simplicity of that truth hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about politeness. It was about recognition, about acknowledging another person's dignity, their right to be treated with respect. And that was what had made the situation feel so heavy. It wasn't just that Melissa Carter had been rude. It was that she had dismissed his very presence. As the taxi moved through the streets, Walter's thoughts wandered again. How many of the other passengers had noticed what had happened, but stayed silent? How many had felt uncomfortable, but didn't want to get involved? And how often did this sort of thing happen? To elderly passengers, to people who were easy to ignore, to those who didn't have the energy or confidence to push back. Walter had never been someone who demanded attention. He had spent his life being respectful, not making waves unless it was necessary. But today, he had been forced into a position where he had to make a choice: let it go or stand his ground. And he had chosen to stand. He just hadn't expected it to change him. As the city lights flickered across the taxi window, he let out a slow breath, realizing that this wasn't just a flight he would talk about. It was a flight that had changed the way he saw everything. As the taxi rolled through the streets, Walter Grayson stared out the window, his thoughts running in circles. How many people on that plane had noticed what had happened, but had stayed silent? How many had felt uncomfortable, but chose not to get involved? And how often did people witness someone being disrespected and decide it was easier to look away? The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about his experience. This was about a pattern that existed in so many places. In restaurants, in customer service lines, in hospitals, places where people were expected to serve, to accommodate, to help, but where they weren't always treated with the same courtesy in return. This flight had become symbolic of something bigger. It wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. It was about how easy it was for people to slip into attitudes of superiority when they had power over others, and how easy it was for them to ignore the needs, the feelings, and the basic dignity of another person. The taxi pulled up to his building, snapping Walter out of his thoughts. The driver turned to him, expectant. Walter fumbled for his wallet, paid the fare, and stepped out into the cool evening air. As the cab pulled away, he took a deep breath. The day's events had left a mark on him, but strangely, as he walked toward his building, he felt something else, a sense of closure. Not because the flight was over, but because he had done what was right. He had stood up for himself, and in the end, that was enough. Walter stepped through the front door of his apartment, setting his bag down in the familiar space. His old armchair by the window, the framed photos of family and friends on the walls, everything exactly as he had left it. And yet, somehow, he felt different. He hung up his coat, neatly placed his shoes by the door, and exhaled. But the weight of the day didn't lift. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It had become something deeper, something that wouldn't fade away so easily. Walter found himself at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the city streets below. Life outside carried on as usual, people rushing home from work, the honking of cars, the distant hum of the city. But inside, his mind was still tangled up in everything that had happened. He had always prided himself on staying calm, avoiding confrontation when possible. But today had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. He rarely encountered people who treated him with such blatant disregard, and even less often did he have to respond to it. He had been raised to respect others, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to understand that everyone had their own struggles. But what happened on that plane wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to dismiss him, to make him feel like he didn't matter. And as much as he hated to admit it, that had shaken him to his core. He stood up and walked over to the window, watching the world move below him. So many people, each lost in their own worries, their own thoughts. And yet here he was, still stuck on what had happened. Had it really been worth all the drama? Should he have just let it go? Part of him wondered if he had made too much of a fuss, but another part of him knew. If he had stayed quiet, if he had let himself be treated that way without speaking up, he would have regretted it. He thought back to that pivotal moment on the plane, when he had asked to speak to the captain. That was the moment he could have let it go, could have shrugged it off, could have just accepted the poor service and moved on. But he hadn't. And while he wasn't someone who sought conflict, he had felt something stir within him that he couldn't ignore. His voice had been steady, his request had been simple, but in that moment, he had made a choice that set everything in motion. For all the awkwardness, for all the discomfort, for all the tension, he didn't regret it. But as he thought about Melissa Carter, he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen to her? He knew the airline would investigate. But he also knew how these things worked. Some mistakes got brushed aside. But what if she was fired? What if the consequences were harsher than he expected? He couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt for the role he had played in that. Even though she had been the one to escalate things, even though she had brought this on herself, It wasn't like he had wanted to see anyone lose their job. No one ever did. But at the same time, her behavior had been unacceptable. Still, Walter couldn't shake the weight of it, knowing that his actions had set off a chain reaction that could alter the course of someone's life. As the night wore on, Walter sat down in his old armchair with a cup of tea. The warmth of it settled in his hands, grounding him in the present. But his mind was still far away. Still somewhere on that plane. Still reflecting on a day that had changed him in ways he never expected. And he knew this was a lesson he would carry for a long, long time. As Walter Grayson sat in his chair, trying to unwind, the events of the day kept replaying in his mind. The flight, the confrontation, the people who had watched, silent and unsure. How many of them had felt uncomfortable but had said nothing? How many had seen someone being mistreated and had chosen not to intervene? It was a thought that nagged at him, refusing to let go, because this wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about something much bigger. It was about how often people let small injustices go unnoticed. How easy it was to tell yourself, "It's not my problem." How easy it was to stay quiet to avoid rocking the boat. But today, Walter had made a choice. He hadn't let it slide. He had stood up. And even if it had created a storm of discomfort, it had felt like the right thing to do. Standing up for yourself isn't easy. It doesn't always come with immediate satisfaction, but it makes a statement. Not just to the person who wronged you, but to everyone else who was watching. It says, "I will not be dismissed. I will not let my dignity be trampled." And Walter realized that was a message worth sending. The evening dragged on, and eventually he turned in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts kept circling back to the flight, the confrontation, the people involved. Would the airline actually do something? Would they make changes to ensure this never happened again? Or would it be forgotten, just another incident that faded into nothing? Walter didn't know, but he hoped that something good would come from the mess. Big or small, it didn't matter, as long as it meant something. The next morning, Walter went about his usual routine, but something inside him had shifted. The flight had opened his eyes. It had shown him just how fragile respect and decency could be in public spaces, how easily they could be crossed, how often they were ignored, and how important it was to stand firm when they were. Walter had always considered himself a quiet man, someone who avoided unnecessary conflict. But now he knew, if something didn't sit right, he wouldn't just stay quiet. This experience had made him stronger. Even though it had been uncomfortable, it had taught him something. Respect isn't a luxury, it's a basic expectation. And moving forward, no matter where he was, he would hold on to that expectation. Days passed. Walter tried to move on, tried to let it go. But the memory of that flight clung to him like a shadow. Every time he walked through the crowded streets of the city, he thought about the passengers who had witnessed it. Some, like the woman who had spoken to him after the flight, had acknowledged it. Others had simply watched in silence, unsure of how to react. And Walter kept coming back to the same thought. Why do people choose silence over action? How many times had people seen someone being mistreated and just let it happen? What bothered him the most was the realization that, most of the time, people don't speak up. They let things slide because it's easier, because they don't want to get involved, because they tell themselves it's not their fight. Walter had been one of those people for most of his life, content to mind his own business, to avoid confrontation unless it was necessary. But that flight had changed something inside him. It had forced him to see things differently. Because this wasn't just about demanding respect for himself. It was about realizing that respect, once lost, can't be regained with a simple apology. Once the line is crossed, there's no going back. It wasn't just Melissa Carter's behavior that stayed with him. It was the way the entire situation unfolded. From the moment she refused his request, he had known. This wouldn't be an ordinary flight. But what happened next? He never could have predicted that. The escalation, the captain's intervention, the flight attendant's removal. Walter Grayson could never have predicted how quickly things would spiral. As he sat in his favorite chair that evening, a warm cup of tea in hand and a newspaper folded on his lap, his mind drifted back to the power dynamics at play. He had been just another passenger, an elderly man making a simple request. But in that moment, the flight attendant, Melissa Carter, had held all of the power. She had control over whether he was acknowledged, whether he was served, and ultimately how he was treated. And yet, the moment Walter spoke up, the balance had shifted. For once, he had taken control of the situation, and the effect had been both immediate and irreversible. As he reflected on the day, he found himself thinking about the nature of power, how quickly it could be abused, how easily people in positions of authority could lose sight of their responsibility to treat others with dignity. If a flight attendant could dismiss an elderly passenger so easily, how many others were experiencing similar mistreatment, in big ways and small, every single day? It wasn't just about Melissa Carter. It was about everyone in the service industry, those who interacted with people daily and had the power to either lift them up or break them down. And tonight, as he sat in his quiet apartment, Walter realized something. There was a difference between being polite and being passive. There was a difference between letting things go and standing up when something was wrong. He had always been someone who picked his battles wisely. But today, standing up had made all the difference. And maybe, just maybe, standing up for others would make a difference too. As the days passed, Walter couldn't help but wonder about the other passengers on that flight. Had they gone home and forgotten about what happened? Or had some of them, like him, been left with a sense that something had changed? Had they watched Melissa Carter being escorted off the plane and thought about their own experiences, their own moments of being mistreated? Would they speak up next time they saw someone being treated unfairly? Or would they stay silent, as so many had before? A week after the flight, an email arrived in Walter's inbox. It was from the airline, a standard message thanking him for his feedback and acknowledging the incident. They assured him that an investigation had been initiated and that they took all customer concerns seriously. There were no specifics, no details about what would happen next, but at the very least, they were taking it seriously. Walter wasn't sure how much weight to give their words, but the lingering question remained. What would the outcome be? On one hand, he knew Melissa Carter had acted inappropriately, and there should be consequences for that. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that her entire career might be upended by this one moment. Was it really just a bad day for her? Or was her lack of respect something deeper, something that had likely affected many passengers before him? Walter knew he would probably never know the full story. And maybe that was okay. Because the truth was, he didn't need to know what happened next. What mattered most was the lesson he had learned from the experience. He had learned that standing up for yourself, even when it feels uncomfortable or risky, is important. And standing up for others when they are being mistreated, that was just as important. He had seen the ripple effect of one person's actions. He had felt that ripple himself. And now, he knew. When something is wrong, it's up to each of us to make sure it doesn't go unchecked. The next time he boarded a flight, or sat in a restaurant, or dealt with someone in a position of authority, he would be more aware, more mindful, more willing to speak up when something wasn't right, because it wasn't about being confrontational. It was about ensuring that the basic principle of respect was upheld for everyone. And maybe, just maybe, the next person who found themselves in a similar situation would take a lesson from what had happened to him. Maybe they would feel empowered to speak up, to demand better treatment, to stand firm in their dignity. Because after all, sometimes, the most unexpected moments have the power to change everything. Weeks passed. Walter Grayson settled back into his normal routine. His morning walks through the park, afternoons spent catching up with old friends, evenings at his favorite cafe. Life, in many ways, had returned to its usual rhythm. And yet, the events of that flight still clung to him, like a song playing softly in the background of his mind. He had been on many flights before. Some had been long, some had been uncomfortable, some had been outright frustrating, but none had stayed with him like this one. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about how one small moment had spiraled into something bigger, how one person's actions, good or bad, could ripple out and affect everyone around them, and how easily power could shift when someone found the courage to speak up. Walter began noticing things more, little moments of disrespect, subtle dismissals, people being ignored, brushed aside, spoken to in clipped tones by those who held even the smallest amount of authority over them. He had always been someone who kept his head down, who didn't get involved unless absolutely necessary. But now he kept asking himself, what if I spoke up this time? What if I took action instead of looking away? The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't about a single flight attendant's rudeness. This was about something much larger, a deeper issue about how people treat each other, especially in situations where power dynamics were at play. Melissa Carter had been in a position of authority, and in that moment, Walter, a paying customer, had felt powerless. But the second he made his voice heard, everything shifted. It was like a crack in a dam, and suddenly the floodgates had opened. How many times had people let things go until they couldn't anymore? One evening, as he sat down with a book and a cup of tea, his phone buzzed. A message from his daughter. She lived across the country and had heard about the flight through mutual acquaintances. "Dad, I heard about what happened. What's the full story?" Walter hesitated. She had always had a way of cutting right to the heart of things, and he knew she would want the truth, unfiltered and unvarnished. So he told her everything. From Melissa's dismissive attitude to the captain's intervention, and how even after everything, he still felt conflicted. Her response was immediate. "Dad, you did the right thing. I know it's not easy for you to make a scene, but sometimes you have to. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself and for all the people who were watching too. It's not just about what happens to you, it's about what happens to everyone when we let things slide." Walter sat there, staring at the screen. Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. She was right. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what had been witnessed, about that collective moment when people saw an injustice and had to decide, would they speak up or would they ignore it? And that was when Walter realized he wasn't alone in this. He had made a choice to stand up for himself, but that choice had affected others. It had shown them, without words, that it was okay to assert yourself when you were being disrespected, that it was okay to demand basic human decency, even when it felt uncomfortable. For the first time, Walter understood. That flight hadn't just been a personal battle. It had been a shared experience. The other passengers had witnessed the whole thing. And whether they had spoken up or not, many of them had been affected by it. Some had silently rooted for him. Others had probably felt uncomfortable with the confrontation. But in the end, they had all seen what happened when someone decided to challenge mistreatment. And that, Walter realized, was where real change could begin. His thoughts wandered further. What if people saw what had happened to him and realized they, too, could speak up in situations where they felt disrespected? What if others in their own lives felt empowered to confront injustices that would otherwise go unnoticed? He understood now. His actions, however small they had seemed in the moment, had the potential to inspire others. It was a lesson that had taken him years to learn. But now that he had learned it, he knew it was something he could never forget. His daughter's message stayed with him, and the next time he found himself in a situation where someone tried to dismiss him, where he saw someone being treated unfairly, where he felt that familiar pressure to just stay silent, he didn't. With time, Walter Grayson found that something inside him had shifted. Before that flight, he had always been someone who avoided conflict when possible. He let things go, didn't make waves, and believed that keeping the peace was more important than speaking up. But now he didn't hesitate. If a store clerk treated him dismissively, he calmly asserted himself. If someone interrupted him in a conversation, he spoke with confidence and reclaimed his space. He wasn't becoming someone he wasn't. He was simply becoming more aware of the power he held in his own voice. And as he reflected on that power, he found himself thinking back to Melissa Carter. He still didn't know what had happened to her. Had the airline fired her? Given her another chance? Would she learn from the experience, just as he had? Whatever consequences she faced, Walter knew they wouldn't just be because of her actions. They would be shaped by the ripple effect of that one moment. He hoped, for her sake, that she had taken something from it. Because in the end, Everyone on both sides of a confrontation has a chance to grow and change. That was the real lesson he carried forward. Sitting back in his chair, a quiet sense of peace settled over him. He didn't know what would come next. Would the airline take real action? Would the passengers who had witnessed it remember what they saw? He had no way of knowing. But what he did know was this: one small decision had made a difference. And sometimes that was enough. This experience had taught him something valuable. It wasn't just about standing up for yourself. It was about being part of a broader change. And that kind of change didn't happen through big, dramatic moments. It happened through the quiet, everyday decisions. To speak up. To assert your dignity. To expect the same respect from others that you give to them. And for Walter, that was the most important lesson of all. Months passed. But the memory of that flight never faded. It had become more than just an isolated incident. It had become a defining moment, one that had reshaped the way he saw the world. He carried those lessons with him everywhere. If he saw a cashier being rude to another customer, he didn't just ignore it. If he witnessed someone being spoken down to in a conversation, he made it clear that disrespect wouldn't go unchecked. He wasn't confrontational by nature, but he had learned that silence and passivity allowed disrespect to grow. Now he understood that standing firm and simply saying something could shift the balance of power. He didn't expect to change the world, but he did know that every time he spoke up, he was adding to a quiet shift. A shift where people realized they weren't alone in demanding respect, because he wasn't the only one who had once felt small, ignored, or dismissed. There were countless others who had silently accepted mistreatment. But what if more people started speaking up? What if, little by little, people began to take back that power, even in the smallest ways? Even if it was just one person at a time. One afternoon, Walter sat in his favorite cafe, sipping his usual coffee and reading a book. At the table next to him, he overheard two women talking. The older of the two was explaining a recent flight she had taken. She had asked a flight attendant for help with her seatbelt, and the response she had received was cold and dismissive. The younger woman across from her was visibly shocked, but the older woman just shrugged. "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," she said. "It wasn't worth it." Walter listened for a moment. Then, without thinking too much about it, he leaned slightly toward their table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but steady. Both women turned to look at him, surprised by the interruption. "I couldn't help overhearing," he continued. "I've been in a situation like that before, and I know it can feel awkward, but sometimes standing up for yourself is the best thing you can do." He gave a small smile. "It doesn't have to be a big confrontation, but it's important to set boundaries. You're entitled to be treated with respect, just like anyone else." For a moment, the older woman just looked at him. Then slowly she smiled. "You're right," she admitted. "I guess I never thought about it that way." Walter nodded. She had just learned the same lesson he had, because sometimes all it takes is one person to remind us that respect is never too much to ask for. The older woman smiled, nodding slowly, as if something had just clicked into place. "I just didn't want to make a fuss," she admitted. Walter Grayson gave her a reassuring nod. "Trust me, it's not about making a fuss," he said. "It's about setting the tone for how people treat you. If you show them that you won't accept being brushed off or ignored, they'll start to respect that. It's empowering." The younger woman, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "I think I need to remember that too," she said thoughtfully. "I've let a lot of things slide in my life, and maybe I shouldn't." The conversation shifted after that, but Walter could tell something had changed in the air. The older woman seemed lighter, as though she had just discovered a new possibility. The younger woman looked deep in thought, as if she had just unlocked something important within herself. And as Walter left the cafe, stepping out into the cool evening air, he realized something. That flight, the tension, the frustration, the confrontation, hadn't just changed him. It had given him the chance to change others too. By speaking up in that moment, he had done more than stand his ground. He had planted a seed. A thought, an idea, a new perspective in the minds of people who might not have considered standing up for themselves before. Just as Melissa Carter, the flight attendant, had unknowingly planted something in him, a realization about the power of his own voice. He had now passed that awareness to others. And the more he thought about it, the more he saw the true value of that experience wasn't in how it had played out, but in what it had set into motion. The ripples of that one moment had spread further than he could have imagined. It was no longer about one flight. It was about a larger shift, a quiet awakening to the fact that we all have a role to play in shaping the kind of world we want to live in. A world where respect and dignity aren't privileges, but the baseline for every interaction. Where people don't just hope for change, they create it through their own actions. And in a way, Walter felt grateful. Grateful for the reminder that life isn't about waiting for things to get better. It isn't about hoping that someone else will fix what's wrong. Change starts with us, with our choices, with how we react when we see injustice, no matter how small. It isn't always easy. It doesn't always feel good, but it's necessary. As Walter walked home, the evening sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the street. For the first time since that flight, he felt lighter. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, not because the world had suddenly changed overnight, but because he had taken control in the way that mattered most. He had taken responsibility for his own dignity, and in doing so, he had helped others realize that they could do the same. When he got home, he settled into his armchair by the window. The familiar space wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. The city hummed outside, life moving forward as it always did. And yet he had changed. He had learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his days. That respect, whether given or denied, exists in every moment, in every interaction. That the world is full of opportunities to stand up, to speak out, to remind others that they matter. And as long as he had the ability to choose, he knew where he stood.